What if the last thing your grandfather left you wasn't money? What if it was a secret, buried beneath 70 acres of ancient forest? A secret worth $24,000, and possibly the future of an entire town. 3 weeks ago, Ethan Vance was living a completely different life. 42 floors above Seattle, surrounded by glass walls, computer screens, and endless meetings, Ethan's world was built on numbers. But then, one phone call changed everything. His grandfather was dead, and Ethan had just inherited a crumbling cabin, an old barn, 70 acres of forest, and a $24,000 tax debt that could cost him the entire property. He came to Blackwood, Oregon with only one plan: sell the land, pay the debt, and return to Seattle. But he didn't know. His grandfather had been preparing something for 30 years. Something hidden inside that old barn. And the moment Ethan opened that door, his entire understanding of his grandfather would begin to change. The rain hovered over the dark forests of the Pacific Northwest as Ethan Vance stood alone on the rotten wooden porch of his grandfather's cabin. Below him, the small town of Blackwood slept quietly in the valley. Ethan held a cup of bitter black coffee in his hand. He had come here to finish his grandfather's affairs. He had no intention of staying. But sometimes, the places we return to bury the past are the very places that reveal who we really are. The Sound of Rustling Pines. Part 1. The Weight of Steel and Cedar. The rain in the Pacific Northwest didn't fall so much as it hovered. A cold, needle-thin mist that turned the towering Douglas firs into dark, jagged sentinels against a bruised gray sky. Ethan Vance stood on the rotting wooden porch of his grandfather's cabin, a lukewarm mug of black diner coffee heavy in his hand. Below the ridge, the small town of Blackwood, Oregon, lay tucked into the valley like an afterthought. A cluster of rusted tin roofs, gravel roads, and the distant, rhythmic hum of the lumber mill that had given the town its heartbeat for nearly a century. He took a sip, wincing as the bitter liquid hit his tongue. Ethan was 32, though the faint silver threads at his temples and the permanent crease between his brows made him look 5 years older. 3 weeks ago, he'd been sitting in a glass-walled office on the 42nd floor of a Seattle tech firm, analyzing supply chain logistics for an e-commerce giant. He had lived by metrics, key performance indicators, and 90-minute sprint meetings. Then came the call from a county coroner he'd never met. Arthur Vance, Ethan's estranged grandfather, had passed away peacefully in his sleep at 84, leaving behind a crumbling 70-acre homestead, a barn full of antique woodworking machinery, and a tax lien that threatened to see the whole property auctioned off on the courthouse steps by the end of the summer. Ethan's original plan had been simple: drive down, sign the probate paperwork, list the land with a local realtor, and get back to his apartment before his accrued paid time off ran out. But walking through the threshold of the cabin had felt like stepping into a tomb preserved in amber. The air smelled of wood smoke, motor oil, dried lavender, and old paper. On the kitchen table lay an open ledger, a half-filled fountain pen, and a freshly carved wooden spoon. Arthur hadn't been waiting to die. He'd just been mid-thought. "You're going to catch pneumonia standing out here in a fleece vest, city boy." Ethan turned to see a woman walking up the muddy gravel driveway, her work boots crunching softly against the stones. She wore a faded canvas jacket stained with green sap at the cuffs, a dark knit cap pulled low over dark hair, and carried a heavy leather tool roll under her arm. "Clara," Ethan acknowledged, setting his coffee mug down on the railing. "I didn't hear your truck. Left it by the mailbox. Your driveway's washing out near the culvert. You need to clear the leaves before the heavy downpour hits tonight, or you'll lose the lower bank." Clara stood at the bottom of the porch steps, wiping her boots on the iron scraper. Clara Vance, no relation, though half the county seemed to share the name through distant pioneers, was the town's primary timber restorer and furniture maker. She had been Arthur's apprentice for the last 6 years, a fact Ethan had only discovered when he found her name listed as the executor of his grandfather's personal effects. "I'm leaving for Seattle on Friday," Ethan said, pulling his hands into his pockets against the chill. "The real estate agent says a developer from Portland is interested in the acreage. They want to clear-cut the upper ridge and put in luxury eco-cabins. Clara's jaw tightened slightly, a subtle shift that Ethan would have missed if he hadn't spent the last 3 days watching her navigate the town. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't yell. In Blackwood, people didn't waste energy on grand gestures. They saved their breath for the work. Your grandfather spent 40 years replanting that ridge after the '82 fire, Ethan, she said quietly, ascending the steps and setting the tool roll on the outdoor bench. He selection harvested only what was dying or crowded out. That forest isn't just trees. It's an old-growth sanctuary. And the barn. The timber in that barn was milled before the First World War. It's just wood, Clara, Ethan replied, though the words felt hollow even to him. And I have a mortgage in the city. I can't afford to pay off $24,000 in back taxes out of pocket just to keep a house I haven't lived in since I was 10. Clara looked at him for a long moment, her storm-gray eyes assessing him with the precision of someone measuring a joist for strain. She unbuckled the brass straps of her tool roll, revealing a row of hand-forged chisels, Japanese pull saws, and brass marking gauges. Tools polished until they gleamed despite their age. It's not just wood, she said, picking up a small, rectangular block of dark, dense timber from the bench. This is old-growth Pacific yew. It grew in the shadow of the ridge for 200 years before a storm brought it down 6 years ago. Touch it. Ethan hesitated, then reached out. The wood was cold, but shockingly smooth, heavy as iron, with grain lines so tight they looked like drawn ink. Feel the grain, Clara instructed softly. A machine sees a tree as board feet and revenue per acre. Arthur saw it as a story. Every ring is a dry summer, a harsh winter, or a year the canopy opened up and let the light in. You work with spreadsheets, Ethan. You think in numbers that disappear when you turn off a screen. When you build something out of this, it stays after you're gone. Ethan looked from the block of wood to Clara's hands, which were calloused, short-nailed, and stained with walnut oil. What are you getting at, Clara? The estate auction isn't for another 6 weeks, she said, leaning against the porch railing. The local historical society got a grant to restore the interior of the 19th century church down in town, the one with the original black walnut altar that split during the ice storm last winter. The board offered the contract to Arthur 3 months ago. $12,000 for the restoration, plus another $12,000 if we build the matching choir stalls from the dried timber in your grandfather's loft. Ethan let out a dry, skeptical laugh. Clara, I don't know how to use a table saw without risking 3 fingers. I analyze data. I know how to work the wood, Clara replied, unblinking. But I can't do a 2-person job alone in 6 weeks. The timber beams in that loft weigh 200 pounds each. I need someone who knows how to keep a schedule, manage the logistics, and pull the other end of a crosscut saw. She stepped closer, pointing toward the heavy wooden double doors of the barn 40 yards away. You want to pay off the county without selling the ridge to a developer who'll turn it into asphalt and gravel? Help me finish Arthur's last commission. $24,000. We split the work, we pay the county, and then, if you still want to sell, at least you sell it on your own terms, not under an auctioneer's gavel. Ethan turned toward the valley. Below, the lights of Blackwood were beginning to flicker on as twilight settled over the mountains. He thought of his desk in Seattle, the dual monitors, the Slack notifications popping up every 40 seconds, the endless cycle of optimization for products nobody truly needed. He thought of his grandfather, a man who had chosen to live in near-total solitude, carving a life out of raw timber with patience and quiet dignity. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of crushed pine needles and damp earth. 6 weeks, Ethan asked, turning back to her. 6 weeks, Clara said. 10 hours a day. No shortcuts. We use Arthur's hand tools for the finish work, just like the contract specifies. You'll have blisters by noon tomorrow, and your back will ache before the week is out. Ethan looked down at his soft, clean hands, then at the heavy block of Pacific yew sitting on the bench. Show me the barn, he said. The interior of the barn smelled like a century of cedar shavings, iron filings, and cold earth. High above, thick timber trusses arched like the ribs of an ancient wooden ship. Stacked along the western wall were thousands of feet of cured lumber. Walnut, Douglas fir, maple, and rare burls, labeled in his grandfather's neat, sloping handwriting with white chalk. Clara walked over to a heavy cast-iron workbench anchored to the concrete floor. Mounted to it was a massive, vintage pattern-maker's vise. Resting on the bench was a 6-foot slab of deep, chocolate-brown black walnut, its center marred by a jagged 3-foot fissure where the church altar had cracked under the weight of a fallen beam. "This is the heart of it," Clara said, running her hand along the fractured wood. "It's unstable. If we just glue it and clamp it, the internal tension will tear it apart again the moment the humidity shifts next winter." "So how do you fix it?" Ethan asked, stepping closer and examining the rough texture of the slab. "You don't force it," Clara said. "You inlay butterfly joints, dovetail keys made of a harder wood, like white oak. They span the crack and lock the two sides together. The worse the tension gets, the tighter the joint pulls." She looked up at Ethan, her gaze steady in the dim yellow light of the overhead hanging bulb. "It holds the break together without hiding the fact that it was broken." Ethan reached out, his fingertips tracing the jagged split in the walnut. For the first time in 3 weeks, the frantic, noise-filled chatter in his head seemed to quiet down, replaced by the steady, heavy silence of the timber around them. "When do we start?" he asked. Clara picked up an iron marking knife from the bench and set it in his palm. The metal was cold, heavy, and sharp. "Right now," she said, "the sound of rustling pines. Part 2 grain, fire, and steel." By the 4th day, Ethan's hands were a ledger of mistakes. Small crescents of raw skin dotted his palms where the wooden handles of the chisels had rubbed through his thin grip. His lower back throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that no amount of cheap motel aspirin could dull. But the silence in his mind was complete. In Seattle, his brain had been a ceaseless stream of notifications, red status bars, and urgent calendar invites. Here, the world compressed into the 6-inch span of a steel blade moving across a grain of white oak. "You're pushing with your shoulders," Clara said without looking up from her own bench. She was hand-planing a 8-foot timber beam destined for the church choir stalls. Long, razor-thin ribbons of pale would curling up from her iron plane like silk ribbons. "If you force the chisel, the blade bites too deep and tear out the grain. Let the steel do the work. You're just guiding the angle." Ethan paused, wiping a bead of sweat from his nose with the back of his forearm. He was working on cutting his first butterfly joint, a double dovetail wedge meant to bridge the main crack in the black walnut altar slab. He had already ruined 2 test pieces of scrap wood, his lines wavering just enough to leave an ugly gap between the key and the socket. "If the fit isn't exact to 1/100th of an inch, it doesn't lock," Ethan muttered, staring at the tiny gap in his test block. "In software, if a joint isn't tight, you refactor the code. Here, I just wasted 3 hours of work." "It's not wasted," Clara said, setting her plane down with a dull thud. She walked over to his bench, picked up his failed block, and held it up to the bare hanging light bulb. "You learned that the grain on this side dives downward. You were cutting against the growth rings. Wood isn't plastic, Ethan. It grew in wind and snow. It has a memory of every storm it survived. You can't command it. You have to negotiate with it." She handed the block back to him, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was rough, hardened by pine resin and steel, yet her touch was surprisingly gentle. "Take a break," she said. "The air in here is thick. Let's get some fresh air." They walked down to the edge of the clearing where the forest met the homestead's upper pasture. The rain had ceased for the afternoon, leaving behind a low-hanging fog that clung to the valleys like white cotton. The air tasted of wet slate and hemlock. "How long did you work with him?" Ethan asked, leaning his elbow against the weathered fence post. 6 years, Clara replied, looking up at the dark ridge of old-growth Douglas firs. "I moved back here after my dad lost his battle with cancer. I had a degree in fine arts from Portland State, a mountain of student debt, and no idea how to survive in a world that only valued things you could buy in a plastic box. Arthur found me down at the hardware store trying to buy a cheap plywood door. He took one look at my truck, saw my sketchbooks on the dash, and told me if I wanted to build real things, I should show up at his barn at 7 the next morning. He never mentioned you in his letters, Ethan admitted quietly. Clara offered a faint, sad smile. Arthur didn't write about people, Ethan. He wrote about work. But he talked about you. Every time a package came from Seattle with a holiday card or a photo, he'd pin it to the wall behind his drafting desk. Ethan frowned. He never called. When my mother died, he came to the funeral, stood in the back row under an umbrella, and left before the reception. I thought he hated the city. I thought he hated us for leaving. He didn't hate the city, Clara said, turning to face him. He was ashamed. Ashamed of what? Of not having anything to offer you, she said simply. Arthur came from a generation of men who believed their worth was tied to what they could hand down to their children. When the lumber industry collapsed in the 90s, he lost his pension. He watched this town hollow out. Young people leaving, shops boarding up, the valley being bought piece by real estate conglomerates. He felt like the custodian of a dying world. He thought if you stayed here, you'd be trapped by the same ghosts that kept him here. Ethan looked down at his boots, covered in yellow sawdust and brown mud. All those years, he had assumed his grandfather's silence was coldness. He had pictured Arthur as a stoic hermit who preferred timber to human connection. He hadn't realized that silence could be a shield built to protect someone else from disappointment. "Come on," Clara said softly, touching his sleeve. "There's something you need to see." She led him back into the barn, not toward the benches, but toward a narrow wooden ladder built into the back wall that led up to the high storage loft. The loft was dark, illuminated only by a round gable window coated in decades of grime and spiderwebs. Stacks of seasoned lumber stretched into the gloom, but Clara walked straight to an iron-bound sea chest sitting under the slope of the roof. She reached onto a nearby rafter, pulled down a brass key hidden behind a rusty jar of nails, and unlocked the padlock. Inside were not tools or heirlooms, but dozens of rolled architectural blueprints, hand-drawn maps, and leather-bound notebooks. Ethan knelt beside the chest, unrolling one of the thick parchment sheets. It was an intricately detailed survey map of the entire 80-acre valley, drawn in black India ink with watercolored shading. Every single old-growth tree over 3 feet in diameter was marked with a tiny red, accompanied by dates, species names, and notes on soil health. He wasn't just logging this land, Ethan whispered, his eyes scanning the precise handwriting. He was mapping an ecosystem. He was trying to create a conservancy, Clara explained, kneeling opposite him. For 30 years, Arthur secretly bought back adjacent parcels of land from failed timber companies using every spare dollar he made from his furniture commissions. He wanted to place the entire upper ridge into a perpetual land trust so it could never be clear-cut. She pulled out a slim blue ledger from the bottom of the chest and handed it to Ethan. "Look at the last page." Ethan opened the ledger. The last entry was dated just 5 days before his grandfather's death. Property tax assessment, $24,110.45. Current reserve, $3,200. Church contract proceeds, $24,000. Note: if the altar and stalls are delivered by August 30th, the trust deed can be finalized. Ethan must sign as the secondary trustee. The land stays whole. Ethan felt a sudden tightening in his chest. The $24,000 wasn't a random debt accumulating from neglect. Arthur had poured every cent of his savings into buying the final 6 acres of the ridge to complete the sanctuary border, leaving himself cash poor right when the annual county tax bill hit. He had worked himself to exhaustion trying to finish the church contract to save the forest for the town, and for Ethan. "He didn't leave you a financial burden, Ethan," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper in the quiet of the loft. "He left you a legacy, but he ran out of time." Before Ethan could answer, the sharp, metallic crunch of car tires on gravel echoed from the driveway outside, followed by the heavy slam of a car door. Ethan and Clara descended the ladder and stepped out of the barn into the cool afternoon air. Standing beside a sleek, silver SUV parked near the cabin porch was a man in his late fortnight 40, wearing tailored wool slacks, an expensive waterproof jacket, and polished leather boots that had clearly never touched real mud. "Ethan Vance?" the man asked, holding out a manicured hand as they approached. "I'm Marcus Vance, no relation, though I suppose we share some distant ancestry. I'm the acquisitions director for Cascade Timber Holdings." Ethan looked at the offered hand, then at the man's polished car. He didn't shake it. "You're the developer trying to buy the land at the county auction." Marcus smiled smoothly, lowering his hand without a trace of embarrassment. "Let's not use the word auction, Ethan. It sounds so predatory. We're offering to assume the tax debt immediately, pay out an additional $50,000 to you directly for the deed, and close within 48 hours. You wouldn't have to spend another night in this cold house or worry about selling off old machinery." Clara stepped forward, her eyes cold. "The property isn't for sale, Marcus. The church contract covers the tax lien." Marcus turned his smile toward Clara, though his eyes remained sharp and calculating. "Ah, Clara, always the idealist. But let's be realistic. The church board's deadline is in 3 weeks. Arthur is gone. The altar slab is severely cracked, and everyone in town knows you can't complete a timber framing job of that scale alone. If you miss the deadline, the contract is voided. The church claims the breach of contract penalty, and the county forecloses anyway." He turned back to Ethan, stepping closer and speaking in a low, pragmatic tone that sounded hauntingly familiar. It was the exact tone Ethan used in corporate boardrooms when convincing clients to abandon failing projects. "Look at the numbers, Ethan," Marcus urged. "You're an analyst. You know risk management. You're spending your vacation sweating over dead wood in a freezing barn with no guarantee you'll finish on time. Take the $50,000. Go back to your life in Seattle. Let a professional forestry firm handle this land." Ethan looked past Marcus, past the silver SUV, toward the dark green wall of the ridge rising into the mist. He remembered the feel of the 200-year-old Pacific U in his hand. He thought of his grandfather's precise ink dots on the parchment map, preserving trees that had been saplings before America was even a nation. "The deadline is August 30th, Ethan said, his voice flat and steady. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Meaning you're trespassing on private property," Ethan replied, stepping into Marcus's space. "And we have work to do." Marcus's polite smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glare. "You're making a very expensive mistake, Vance. Wood fails under pressure. People do too." "Get off the ridge, Marcus," Clara said quietly. Without another word, Marcus turned, climbed into his SUV, and backed down the muddy driveway, spraying gravel against the wooden fence. Ethan turned to Clara. The adrenaline was still humming through his veins, but beneath it lay a stark, terrifying reality. They had 3 weeks to harvest, cure, cut, and carve hundreds of cubic feet of timber, and his hands were already bleeding. "Can we really do this in 3 weeks?" Ethan asked. Clara looked at the barn, then back at him. A small, resolute grin touched the corner of her lips. "Not if we keep talking about it," she said. "Go put on your heavy leather gloves. We're slinging the oak beams." The sound of rustling pines. Part 3, the strain of grain and bone. By the 3rd week, time in the valley ceased to be measured in hours or days. It was measured in the rhythm of the work, the rasp of the crosscut saw, the dull thump of the wooden mallet, and the sharp, clean scent of newly planed walnut rising like incense into the cold rafters of the barn. Ethan's corporate clothes, the merino wool sweaters and crisp cotton button-downs, lay folded and forgotten in his duffel bag. In their place, he wore an old wool shirt of his grandfather's, the sleeves turned up past his forearms, his hands now lined with dark resin stains and tough, thickened calluses that no longer tore when he pulled on a steel lever. They worked from 6 in the morning until past midnight. The town of Blackwood slept below them, a quiet constellation of yellow lights in the valley, while the barn remained illuminated by 3 suspended halogens that cast long, dramatic shadows against the stacks of timber. "Keep the angle steady at 15 degrees, Clara said, her voice dry with fatigue as she stood over Ethan's shoulder. They were fitting the second of 4 black oak butterfly joints into the underside of the church altar slab. "If you undercut the socket, The joint will pinch the surface grain and force a fracture right down the center when the wood expands. Ethan didn't speak. He held his breath, guiding the tip of a 3/4-inch steel chisel along the chalk line he had laid down with a brass square. The wooden mallet came down in small, controlled taps. Tap, tap, tap. A thin, curling chip of dark wood peeled away, leaving a razor-sharp mortise wall behind. He blew away the fine dust, stepped back, and picked up the carved oak key. He lined it up over the opening and set it gently in place. "Drive it," Clara whispered. Ethan picked up the heavy rubber mallet and brought it down squarely on the center of the key. Thump. The oak key slid into the walnut slab with a dense, hollow sound. A sound of absolute friction, timber locking against timber with zero tolerance for air or movement. The split in the 400-pound slab didn't just close. It seemed to dissolve, the two halves pulled together by the internal geometry of the joint. Ethan let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He ran his bare thumb over the seam. It was completely flush, smooth as polished river stone. "Not bad for a guy who spent his life clicking mice," Clara said softly. A rare, genuine smile broke across her pale, tired face, smoothing out the deep lines of exhaustion around her eyes. "It's not code," Ethan said, looking down at his hands, which were steady now, devoid of the nervous twitch that had plagued him in Seattle. "When you fix a line of code, it stays fixed until the next software update. When you set an oak key into walnut, it stays fixed long after you're under the dirt." Clara leaned her hip against the bench, wrapping her fingers around a warm mug of chicory coffee. "Your grandfather used to say that wood is the only medium that keeps breathing after it's harvested. A stone statue just slowly erodes. A steel beam just waits to rust. But a wooden table responds to the humidity of the room, the oils from the hands that touch it, the seasons passing outside the window. It's alive, Ethan." She looked at him then, her gaze holding his in the dim, warm light of the workspace. For 3 weeks, they had lived in each other's pockets, sharing silent lunches of thick bread and sharp cheddar on the porch, hauling 200-pound fur joists shoulder to shoulder, and pushing past physical exhaustion into a strange, synchronized rhythm. Ethan felt an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with tired muscles. He reached out, his thumb lightly brushing a smear of yellow oak dust from her cheekbone. Clara didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch for a fraction of a second, her eyelids fluttering closed before she opened them, her eyes clear and fiercely present. "We have 16 choir stall panels left to surface," she whispered, though her voice held no hesitation. "Then we'd better get to work," Ethan replied quietly. The storm hit on Thursday night, 3 days before the church board's final inspection. It was not the soft, hovering mist typical of the valley, but a fierce Pacific gales that swept in from the coast, howling through the tops of the Douglas firs like a freight train. Rain hammered against the corrugated tin roof of the barn with a deafening roar, and the old timber frame groaned as 60-mile-an-hour gusts battered the upper ridge. Inside, the halogens flickered violently. "We need to keep the humidity stable in the finishing room," Clara shouted over the noise of the wind, spraying a coat of natural tung oil onto the finished altar top. "If the temperature drops too fast while the oil is setting, the surface will cloud over and bloom." Ethan was carrying a stack of 4 surfaced fir panels toward the drying racks when a sudden, terrifying crack echoed from the northern side of the property, louder than the thunder rolling over the mountains. Through the high gable window, Ethan saw a massive 60-foot hemlock tree, weakened by the rain and high winds, topple inward toward the homestead. "Look out!" Ethan yelled, dropping the panels and lunging across the workspace just as the heavy top branches of the falling tree smashed through the upper loft window and ripped through the corner of the barn roof. Glass, cedar shingles, and splintered rafters rained down into the interior. A heavy structural crossbeam, dislodged by the impact, swung free from the upper truss and crashed directly onto the end of the main assembly bench. The sound of splintering wood was like a gunshot. "Clara!" Ethan screamed through the haze of dust and flying insulation. He scrambled over a pile of broken rafters. Clara was on her knees near the oiling station, her arm pinned under a heavy 12-foot timber joist that had been knocked loose from the upper rack. The heavy walnut altar slab lay just 2 feet away, its edge struck by a falling iron clamp, a deep, jagged gouge now torn into its newly hand-planed border. "I'm okay," Clara gasped, her face pale as chalk, her right arm trapped beneath the crushing weight of the joist. "I'm fine, Ethan, the slab." "To hell with the slab," Ethan roared. He planted his boots on the concrete floor, slid his shoulders beneath the fallen timber joist, and drove upward with every ounce of strength in his legs and back. The iron muscles he had built over 3 weeks of grueling labor burned as he heaved the 200-pound beam off her arm. Clara pulled her arm free, rolling clear just as Ethan dropped the beam back onto the floor with a deafening crash. He collapsed beside her, pulling her into his arms. She was shaking, clutching her bruised forearm to her chest, her breathing ragged. "Are you broken? Speak to me, Clara. Are you broken?" Ethan demanded, his hands framing her face, searching her eyes. "No," she breathed, resting her forehead against his chest as the storm raged through the hole in the roof above them. "Just bruised. I'm okay, Ethan. I'm okay." The workspace. For a long moment, the deadline, the back taxes, the real estate developer, and the church board vanished. All that mattered was the warm, steady heartbeat pressed against his ribs. Then Clara pulled back, looking past his shoulder at the damage. Rain was splashing directly onto the freshly oiled walnut altar. The water was pooling in the raw, jagged gouge left by the fallen clamp. "The inspection is in 48 hours, Clara said, her voice trembling slightly as she looked at the ruined corner of their centerpiece. "We don't have another piece of black walnut this size. It took your grandfather 30 years to season that slab." Ethan stood up, looking at the water dripping onto the dark wood. He looked at the hole in the roof, at Clara's bruised arm, and then at the broken crossbeam lying across the floor. A month ago, he would have panicked. He would have looked at the broken variables, calculated the failure probability, and folded his hands in defeat. Instead, Ethan walked over to the altar slab, picked up a dry canvas cloth, and carefully wiped the rain away from the wood. "We aren't quitting," Ethan said, his voice hard as iron. "Cover the hole in the roof with the heavy tarp from the tractor. I'll rig a winch to clear the debris. Then we're going to fix this slab." Clara looked at him, her gray eyes shining in the flickering light of the single remaining halogen bulb. "Ethan, you can't just sand out a gouge that deep. It'll ruin the symmetry of the edge." Ethan looked down at the deep, jagged scar in the walnut. He remembered the butterfly joints holding the center crack together, the philosophy his grandfather had lived by, the philosophy Clara had taught him on his very first day in the barn. "You don't force it. You don't hide the break. You lock it together." "We aren't going to sand it out," Ethan said, reaching for his tool roll and pulling out a fine-tipped marking gauge. "We're going to inlay it with Pacific U." Clara stared at him for a moment, and then a slow, fierce smile broke across her face despite the rain and the pain in her arm. "The contrast," she whispered. "Dark walnut locked with bright gold hue. It'll show the story of the storm," Ethan said, looking her straight in the eye. "It'll show that this piece survived." Part 4. The Golden Grain. The morning of August 30th dawned with a clarity that felt almost artificial after weeks of heavy coastal mist. The sky over the ridge was a pale, polished blue, and the air smelled crisply of washed cedar and ozone. By 7 in the morning, the flatbed trailer was hitched to the back of Arthur's vintage Ford truck. Restored using heavy canvas straps and moving blankets, the 6-foot black walnut altar slab rested securely in the center, flanked by 16 pristine, hand-planed Douglas fir choir panels. Ethan stood beside the driver's side door, securing the final ratchet strap. His hands were weathered, his shoulders broader, his body entirely remade by 48 days of relentless labor. The gouge from the fallen structural beam was no longer a flaw, it had been transformed. Inlaid into the dark edge of the walnut was a sweeping, lightning-shaped wedge of Pacific yew. Under 3 coats of hand-rubbed tung oil and beeswax, the golden wood burned against the chocolate walnut like a vein of trapped sunlight. Clara walked out of the barn, her right arm bound in a tight compression wrap, though her grip on a thermos of coffee was firm. She looked at the flatbed, then up at Ethan. "Ready to face the jury?" she asked. Ethan adjusted his canvas jacket. "Let's go deliver a church." The First Presbyterian Church of Blackwood sat at the edge of town, a white steepled structure built in 1888 with heartwood redwood siding and hand-blown glass windows. Gathered on the stone steps were 5 members of the local Historical Society board, accompanied by the county assessor and Reverend Thomas, a tall man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Standing at the base of the steps, leaning casually against his silver SUV with his arms crossed, was Marcus Vance. As the old Ford truck rumbled up the gravel driveway and squeaked to a halt, Marcus checked his wristwatch with a cold, performative smirk. 8:15, Marcus said, stepping forward as Ethan killed the engine. The contract explicitly stated 8 o'clock delivery. Ethan, default by 15 minutes. The contract states 8:30 a.m. on the morning of the 30th, Mr. Vance, Reverend Thomas corrected gently, stepping past Marcus with a heavy brass key in hand. The minister looked at the back of the truck, his eyes widening slightly as he saw the golden timber under the canvas. "Let's see the work." Ethan and Clara unstrapped the load. With the help of 2 young volunteers from the church, they carefully lifted the 400-pound altar slab and carried it through the heavy double doors into the cool, silent sanctuary. The sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting ruby and sapphire light across the aisle. They set the slab onto the hand-carved oak base that Arthur had built decades prior. The board members approached in silence. Mrs. Gable, an 80-year-old historian who had known Arthur since childhood, reached out a trembling hand and ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the walnut. She stopped right at the lightning-shaped butterfly inlay of Pacific Yew. "This wasn't in the original blueprints," she murmured, her voice echoing softly in the high-ceilinged nave. Marcus stepped up beside her, pointing a finger. "It's a structural flaw. They used scrap wood to patch a fracture. It violates the historical restoration guidelines. The board should reject the piece immediately and declare the contract void." Ethan didn't back down. He stepped forward, his boots heavy against the floorboards. "That slab survived a storm 2 nights ago," Ethan said, his voice quiet, clear, and resonant in the quiet church. "A hemlock came through the roof of the barn. It split the edge and threatened to ruin the piece. We didn't hide the break, and we didn't throw the timber away. We locked it together with 200-year-old yew from the ridge Arthur spent his life protecting." He looked directly at Reverend Thomas, then at Mrs. Gable. Arthur believed that wood carries the memory of what it survived. This altar was built for a sanctuary. It shouldn't pretend the world outside doesn't have storms. It should prove that something broken can be made stronger than it was before. Reverend Thomas leaned down, pressing his palm flat over the yew inlay. He felt the seamless transition between the golden grain and the dark walnut, a tolerance so precise that not even a strand of silk could slide between them. The minister looked up, a warm smile breaking across his weathered face. "It's magnificent, Ethan. It's not just a restoration. It's a sermon written in timber." Mrs. Gable wiped a tear from her eye and turned to the county assessor. "Sign the completion certificate, George. Pay the contract in full." Marcus's face turned pale, his jaw tightening as the assessor pulled a clipboard from his coat and signed the disbursement release. "This is ridiculous," Marcus snapped, turning on his heel. "You're choosing emotional sentiment over commercial value." "No, Marcus," Ethan called out as the developer reached the church doors. Marcus paused, looking back over his shoulder. Ethan pulled a folded blue ledger from his jacket, the finalized land trust agreement. "We're choosing permanence over quick cash. The ridge isn't an investment opportunity anymore. It's a perpetual sanctuary." Marcus glared at him for a long, silent second, then pushed open the heavy wooden doors and walked out into the sunlight, his leather boots clicking sharply against the stone steps until the sound faded completely away. 2 hours later, Ethan stood in the county clerk's office in town, with the $12,000 completion check and the matching advance for the choir stalls. The clerk stamped the property tax lien paid in full. The 70 acres of old-growth timber, the cabin, and the barn were officially clear of debt. secured safely inside the Arthur Vance Forestry Trust. When they returned to the homestead, the afternoon sun was high, bathing the clearing in golden light. The hole in the barn roof had been temporarily secured with heavy tin sheets, and the air inside still smelled of pine resin, oil, and victory. Ethan walked up the wooden steps of the cabin porch and sat down on the bench. He looked out over the valley, the quiet town, the winding silver ribbon of the river, and the vast, unyielding green canopy of the ridge rising up toward the sky. Clara sat down beside him, setting 2 fresh mugs of coffee on the railing between them. She looked at his profile. The soft city boy who had arrived 7 weeks ago with a suit and a laptop had been entirely erased. In his place was a man grounded, whole, and rooted in the earth beneath his feet. "So," Clara said softly, staring out at the trees, "your PTO ran out 3 weeks ago. Your boss in Seattle has probably filled your desk." Ethan reached into his pocket, pulled out his smartphone. Its battery dead for 4 days, and set it face down on the bench. "I sent my resignation letter from the library computer on Tuesday," Ethan said. Clara turned her head, her gray eyes widening slightly. "You resigned?" "I spent 10 years managing supply chains for things people throw into landfills 6 months later," Ethan said, turning to look at her. "My grandfather spent 84 years building things that will stand in that church for another century." He reached out, his calloused hand closing over hers on the wooden railing. Clara didn't pull away. She turned her palm up, intertwining her fingers with his. "We have 16 choir stall panels to install by October," Ethan said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "And the barn roof needs a permanent frame built out of Douglas fir before the winter snows hit. I don't think I have time for an office job." Clara laughed, a clear, ringing sound that scattered the crows resting in the high branches of the near hemlocks. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the cool mountain breeze rustling through the pines above them. Up on the ridge, the ancient trees stood tall against the sky, their roots anchored deep into the stone and soil, swaying together in a quiet, eternal rhythm that sounded remarkably like home.